Okay, excellent. Well, hello, everybody. I am Deb Matlock coming to you from Colorado with Murphy's Law. That's a truck just drove by, and so my dog is barking for a second, but she's just saying she's excited to be here too. So I am in Boulder, just outside of Denver, and I am really looking forward to chatting with you all today. My hope for our 45 minutes here is that you walk away with a lot of cool ideas, resources, and also some personal inspiration for some things that you might be able to go do for yourself. Because as Ryan was just saying, I know teaching is grueling, and especially after the last 2 years, I kind of think that teachers are modern heroes in a way that is just phenomenal. So my partner's also a middle school teacher, so I know what the trenches on the other side of it has looked like, and it hasn't all been pretty. So rock on to all of you. But again, my name is Deb Matlock, and I've been in environmental education for about 25 years here in Colorado. I have a small business called Wild Rhythms, focusing on offering nature connection trainings for practitioners, educators, and healers, people who want to create their own body of work and incorporate it into what they do. I've worked in nonprofit schools, national state parks, different organizations, and what I have found across the board, K-12 organizations as well, is that environmental education, sense of place, deep nature connection is something that I think weaves into everything that we all do. It plays a beautiful role in whatever it is that we're offering, and integrates well into the way that kids and humans, all of us, adults as well, are kind of oriented towards learning. So we'll be going into a lot of different angles of that today. But what I want to explore specifically is sense of place, and how we can explore that through our wild selves, and consequently our students' wild selves, because that wild self of all of us is a pretty important part. And it's a part that has sort of been demonized and relegated to negative parts of our world in recent decades, but it is where we come from. It is where our kids come from. So before we go further, I want to share my screen for a second, and I just want to capture some of the ideas that you all have that come to mind when you hear the word wild, just off the cuff, association in your brain. And you may have to yell a little bit so I can hear, but yeah, just what comes to mind when you hear the word wild, and I'll capture them here. I can't. I think somebody might have spoken. I may need somebody with a microphone to translate. Is that possible? Yeah, so national park. Did I hear national parks? Okay, I'll put that. I think I heard. I can't quite hear, so I may need a little yelling into the computer there. All right, what else when you hear the word wild? Oh, that's a little louder. Ryan, are you talking to me?
Sorry. Let me type. Should I send them
to you? I can hear you now. However you're standing right now sounds good.
Okay. So we have wildlife.
Wildlife. Rock on. Okay.
Feral.
Oh, good. Feral.
Energy.
Oh, these are fun ones. See, it's always educators that come up with the fun ones. No bias, of course, on my part at all towards education. All right.
Oh, it looks like Pamela put one in the chat.
Okay, what is that one? Well, I'm sharing the screen. I can't see the chat.
Nature, the freedom to go into a new place and explore.
Great. Explore. Okay. Cool. Growth. Anything else?
Maybe growth.
Growth. Save. I like the little electronic sticky notes, although they're not quite as easy as actually being there in person with sticky notes on the wall. But all right, anything else? Just this can be an ongoing, but while we're talking, I would say just keep in mind what you have heard about wild in your life, what you've been told maybe as a child, what you've heard in your training as your educational training, even how sometimes the kids use the word. Because I've even, I've heard kids as young as 5 or 6 today who still, they use wild, and it's negative. It's negative in a way that they've probably been told, don't be so wild, or don't act so crazy, or whatever the pieces are. So I encourage you to just be kind of in your own mind, just saying, what is wild to you? Let me stop the share. What biases might you have, just because we all do? I mean, when I hear wild, I think of my grandmother, who just was always, kids, don't be wild, and she was just wanting us to sit and be quiet all the time, and that's what I kind of soaked up as a very young kid. But wild, when we think of our own connection to place, and we think of our own inner self, I think wild is one of the most profoundly incredible ideas. We are wild beings. Our wildness is what fuels our interests and our passions and our desires. It is the part of us that allows curiosity in our brains. I think when we go outside and we hear a new bird sound or something, we're like, oh, what is that? That's like, that's not a calm sit at the table with my grandmother quietly kind of place. That's a, let me get out there and be part of it. And so what we're talking about today, when we talk about our wild selves, is I think a very positive thing. And it's something that I like to encourage in students a lot, is like, let's just make friends with this wild self that we've all got. And I want to read a definition of wild that I really particularly love. It's by Gary Snyder, from the book called The Practice of the Wild. He says, the wild is often dismissed as chaotic by quote unquote civilized thinkers. It is actually impartially, relentlessly, and beautifully formal and free. Its expression, the richness of plant and animal life on the globe, including us, the rainstorms, windstorms, and calm spring mornings, is the real world to which we belong. So if we think of wildness as where we belong, inner and outer, then how does that free us up to explore it in a way that is very empowering to ourselves and our students? And before we go further, I just want to open up if there are any, cultural, educational, familial biases about wild that you're being reminded of right now that you want to share, just as part of our group discussion, things that are coming up for you, like my sweet, lovely grandmother, who I love dearly, who ironically was also one of my connections to the natural world, was also my connection to wild being a bad thing. I had to work through all of those pieces. But are there anybody have any unique stories or anything that you're being reminded of? Yeah, feel free to talk into the our hybrid world.
Can you hear me?
I sure can. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say one thing I'm struggling with is kids are really afraid of that concept of the wild. Like they don't want to touch the mushroom that I brought from the forest, so they just don't even want to go outside at all. So
Yeah.
it's overcoming that fear that they have.
That is a really good point. Yeah, fear of the wild. I have a good friend who had 2 little boys. They're both teenagers now, and she was living out in Maryland. And she actually called me and said, can you give me some ideas for activities I could do outside with my kids? And I was like, I started giving her things, and every single activity. Well, but if we turn over that leaf, there could be a spider. Or if we walk through the forested area in the park, we could get, we could run into swampy places where there might be snake. I mean, everything, her fear was so profound. And so that is a great point, because I think for all of us as individuals exploring our wild selves, and certainly working with kids, one of the most empowering, important first things is to get those fears out of the way. Because they're also real. I mean, yeah, there were spiders out in Maryland that she probably really didn't want her kid getting bitten by, like I'm not going to argue with that. Here in Colorado, we have mountain lions, bears, rattlesnakes in our trail system. And there was one particular program, but many over the years I've done, where kids have come from other schools, like down in Denver up to Boulder. A lot of these kids are coming from places where this might be their first time to being on a trail area. And they come showing up at the trailhead. I mean, there was one time that tears even. They were so afraid and so convinced they were going to get eaten by mountain lions. A few kids from their class couldn't even get permission slips from the parents to take a trail hike. Now, yes, we have mountain lions, but a group of 15, 20 loud screaming second graders is really not a big attraction to a mountain lion. So, but what I realized really quickly with this group is we were going nowhere with this program if we didn't dig into their fears first. And so that's a really important place with kids going outdoors or exploring things indoors. The window into sense of place starts with the comfort of ourselves being there. And comfort comes with education, I think. Again, waving my big bias flag of the, education is one of the most important things, because if we can say to somebody like here, for example, if I tell kids we've got rattlesnakes, here's how you keep yourself safe in rattlesnake country. You look where you put your hands, you look where you put your feet, give them the empowerment. And then I also try to follow it up with a couple of really cool things about rattlesnakes or mountain lions or whatever it is that we're looking at, poison ivy, finding something that's really amazing too, to say, look, there's a really important role here. But I think that's a great point that you brought up, is getting the fear out of the way so that the exploration can be opened, but getting it out of the way in a way that's safe, which basically means making sure people know what to worry about. It's what are our hazards, insects, animals, weather. In Colorado, lightning is far more dangerous than any wild animal or insect or snake. I mean, lightning kills more people each year in Colorado who are recreating out on the trail than anything else. People often don't think of that as the fear, but that's, where we say, let's just put the empowerment out there. So, knowing your groups and your people and your parents and whoever you're working with, what are the educational and cultural communal biases that they may be bringing to the table? Certainly there are certain cultural groups that I've worked with where the fear of wild animals like bears and mountain lions is more, generally speaking, more prevalent than in other groups. So part of it, is kind of just understanding that. And that's an important part of the diversity, of course, in education, is who are we working with and what are they bringing to the table? I think the other thing to think about too is, what does it say about our culture that wild has become something that we're afraid of or that has a negative connotation? That we've taken this word and we've moved it into those places, more so in our vernacular than looking at it as a positive part of the natural rhythms and the way things work. So we're bumping up against ecological identity here too, which is that people have gotten these stories, they've been told these things. And so going out to do some cool sense of place activities with students who are terrified about bees, there's a place there to start. So I would just say, for just a quick minute here, take a moment and, without making your brain work too hard, jot down if you have a definition of wild, that you had already or that you're thinking of right now. Like if you were just to put a quick definition for yourself of what wild means, with all of your stories, all of your biases, all of your experiences playing into it. And there's no right or wrong answer here. If anybody feels inspired to share their definition, you're welcome to, and always no pressure to share, but if anybody wants to, I'd be totally curious to hear. You may have to, yell into the computer again if you do. Or have a translator at the computer who can bridge that.
I was just jotting down, because I'm joining in the session too.
Awesome.
I jotted down natural and sometimes uncontrolled ecological abundance.
Ooh, I love that. Awesome. Yeah, any other wild definitions?
I wrote down, not under the control of other beings, free to go and do as one pleases.
Cool. Yeah, so it sounds like two themes already of the control piece, which is going to come up at the end here. That's great. Yeah. Anything else?
Growing naturally.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Hey, I was on.
Hey, you know, the short and sweet definitions, sometimes those are the most poignant. I'm always very verbose when I do these kind of things. So I think that's like very admirable. Yeah, I like to think of wild as kind of dancing with the wild world, the ecological world around us in whatever way is natural to us. And so for some person that might mean to be, you know, very rigidly focused on identifying every bird species or taking a walk every day at 6 a.m. You know, for somebody else, it might mean operating from a fully intuitive place of just, oh, I need to be outside right now, or I want to go follow that sound, or I hear there's a storm coming in, I'm going to go watch the sky, or, you know, just how do we allow ourselves to naturally and without being overly controlled explore the world that we are part of. And I think of that world as inside of us and as outside of us. So when I think of that, I think, you know, what is it, honoring the deep wildness inside and outside? What does that allow us to really learn about life? And so one of the ways to kind of access this for us, but also something you may be able to adapt with your students, is to start by saying, you know, we are basically animals and we have a lot in common with wild animals. And we can have this conversation of what do they need to survive turn into something about deep wildness. And so we're going to play with that here for a second. Let me share my screen again and my little Google Jamboard approach here. Okay, next one. So animals, what do they need to survive? I mean, there are some basics that we'll just go through really quickly because I know that you already know these. They need air, got to breathe, right? They need space, room to roam, room to hunt, room to find mates. They need shelter, you know, get out of the storm, keep ourselves safe. They need water and they need food. Nothing there, you know, is something that is probably controversial. Nothing there is probably particularly scary. Everything there is something humans and wild animals of all kinds can relate to. And not even just animals. This can be, you know, plants. This can be insects. You know, it's insects or animals, but, you know, it can be all of that. But when we talk about that deep wildness and what we need to survive, what we need to be able to function in the world, there are several that go beyond the basics too. So are a little beyond the basics. So I've pulled out a few of these that relate a lot to what we're going to be talking about today, and also what I think our students can bring. So sensory awareness, you know, if you think about wild animals, they're not getting very far in the world without a keen awareness and ability to use whatever their appropriate senses are. So for some, you know, that's going to be their eyesight. You think about the eagles and you know, the eyes, and, you know, the animals that are hunters and have the eyes in the front of their heads and they need to be able to see. A lot of them have smaller ears, you know. Then there's sensory awareness of rabbits and deer and animals with really huge ears and their eyes maybe aren't so good. You know, I know the bears can smell for a couple of miles in some cases. You know, their noses are huge, and that's it's one of their dominant ways of interpreting the landscape, is that sensory awareness piece. And the cool thing here is that we're no different, and sensory awareness activities I actually think can be woven into any subject. They can be indoors or outdoors, and they can help us to slow our rhythm down. They can help us as individuals and our students to tap into our own deeper wild selves, our own sense of what are we interested in, what are we intrigued by in this landscape or in this topic. And we'll go in at the end with a bunch of, I've got some resources for you around different sensory awareness activities. Another thing that you know, wildlife biologists will say that wild animals need to survive is a balance between self and group interests. And when I think about that, you know, I think immediately of wolves, coyotes, you know, some of these animals that live in groups, but also, you know, the individual has to eat. The individual needs, you know, to mate, to survive. There's certain dynamics there. You know, even solitary animals like mountain lions, there are parts of their lives where they are more focused on being around their young or their partners than others, you know, so there's a balance between self and group. And I think when we're exploring wildness in ourselves and also with our students, and we're working on developing a sense of place or connecting them closely to a topic, this becomes a really important piece. You know, I'm speaking here as an introvert who really likes those self activities when I'm taking the class. You know, I really just want to get into it and go sit outside and do my own thing. And maybe come in and share a little bit, but I know that I also early on in my education career, I over programmed for that person because that was who I was. But there are plenty of people who are external processors, more extroverted, want to be doing group activities and things like that. So that balance between self and group interests, I think, is a really key part of digging into our wild selves when we're doing sense of place work with our students. So loyalty now in the wild animal world can look a lot of different ways. It can look like defending territory. It can look like the male elk defending his harem of female elks. It can look like partnerships of animals where it's a lifelong mating, like the Canada geese that we have flying over here in Colorado. They when they survive together, I mean, they are a lifelong partnership. So loyalty when it comes to our wild self, I think is knowing where are our passions, what are we really interested in, and can we just continue to learn about it, continue to deepen into it. And, like I think of my own interests in hummingbirds started out as just like a little fly by night, pardon the pun, but this interest has carried me through decades, and it's deepened to the point of becoming a very strong personal metaphor, becoming a very strong way for me to understand my own wild rhythms, my own way of being in the world. And this is a great one. Loyalty is kind of a strange word, but I'm pulling it out of the biological sciences here. But how do we breed that into our programs for our students? This is where we can say, all right, we're doing these sensory awareness, sense of place work. We're incorporating it into this curriculum. This is where I think, we have that student-centered part of saying, what do you want to learn more about? Where is your passion taking you? What do you quote unquote, be loyal to? And giving them that agency to really dig into that can also really feed that wild part of themselves and their natural curiosity to learn and to be inquisitive. Vulnerability is another part in wild animals to survive. I mean, there are definitely examples over and over again where they do have to work together or take risks or move into places that are a little bit scary, or I think about like the squirrel running across the street to get to the tree on the other side that is full of nuts. And, that's a dangerous road. So that vulnerability place, I think when we're talking about our wild selves, is that we've got to have the courage to dig in. We've got to say, wow, so what is it that I'm most afraid of? Or what is it that I'm most uncomfortable with? Sometimes that place is really a rich learning place. I was doing a professional training in January for a group of people, and one woman she was a Reiki horse practitioner, and she was building nature connection programs, and it was really windy the day we were working. It was really very windy, and she just all of a sudden, we were in a group doing a thing. She's like, I got to say this. I am so uncomfortable in the wind. All I want to do is crawl into my car and curl up and stay there until the wind stops. I just hate it. I don't want anything to do with it. She was frustrated. She was irritated. She was at the end of her rope with it. And by the end of the course, 5 weeks later, she had created this whole program around wind and the role it plays and the metaphors for us on a psychological level and how it really was teaching her about her wild self. And so that moment of frustration, she was willing to do it. She was willing to go into that vulnerable place and just say, what is it that I can learn from wind and how can I bring that to my people? So this is a really powerful place for us as educators and also for our students. This is an empowering place to work. That student who's afraid of mountain lions, that could be a really, with delicate support, could be a great place to go. The other piece here that is so important in survival for all of us is intuition. How do we define that? Of course, there's various different ways. But I think when we're talking about our wild selves and we're talking about education with that wild self, there's value in saying, how does intuition fit into this? How does that intuition combine with things like sensory awareness and vulnerability and also getting basic needs met like air, space, shelter, water, food? How do our students come to the table with their questions that they just know are naturally burning inside of them, and where does that journey take us? So that intuitive journey through our passions, through our questions, through our inquisitivity is, I think, a key piece of exploring our wild selves. So those are just a few ideas of thinking of survival beyond just those basic things, because in truth, if you were to take any one of these things out of the experience of a wild animal, there's a good chance the survival would be compromised. And when I look at this from education, if we take any one of these things out of education, I sometimes think there's a good chance that the student experience, you know, may not be as rich as it could be, because we want to allow them to come in with their wild selves and their questions and their intuition. So let's take a second now and just for a moment think about your own life. Are there any wild beings, whether animals, plants, rivers, mountains? Is there a wild being that you feel a particular connection to or interest in? You know, this could be an earthworm, it could be a wolf. In my case, it was the hummingbird. Just think, is there anybody that you particularly resonate with? And then I want to put up just a couple of reflection questions. Let me copy these into the chat. We'll just take a couple minutes. I don't want us to run out of time, but you can also take these questions afterwards as well. But you know, thinking about that wild being, you know, who draws your attention? And then ask yourself, why? Why do they draw my attention? You know, what part of your own wild nature might be reflected in this wild being? And then a really important question is also, how are you different? And I think that how are you different question is a really important one for us to ask ourselves and our students, because it keeps us from getting into that romanticizing place of this sort of thing, but to just sort of let us dance with that for a minute. So I'll stop talking for a couple minutes and let you just sort of take a first run through these questions. Okay, take just about another 30 seconds to wrap up your thoughts, and definitely encourage you to go back to this if it's of interest to you. These questions could take days to answer if you wanted to go in all deep and wild. Does anybody feel inspired to share any from that? Again, no pressure. This stuff can sometimes be personal, but just want to open it up.
I said Mount Shasta.
Say again, I'm sorry.
Mount Shasta. Sorry, she said Mount Shasta.
Mount Shasta, great. Okay. Yeah, and that's a great one, I would imagine, with where you live, because I would imagine that's a place where students also have a connection, you know, could be a fun place to start with something like this. But, you know, asking that, who draws your attention and why? What part of your wild self is reflected? You know, so for like when I think of the hummingbirds, I was fascinated by them. I was like, they always draw my attention. I was asking myself why. Well, why? Because I can't believe what they can do with such tiny bodies and how mobile they are and how they bounce around from flower to flower and how they build these incredible nests. When I asked myself what part of my own wild nature might be reflected, I actually started to find the key to like my own productivity rhythms even. I realize that I don't work as well with sit in one place for 3 hours and do this thing. I work a lot better going from here to here to here to here, bouncing around all day long. And at the end of a day like that, I can sit back and go, wow, I can't believe how much I got done. Versus if somebody says, I need you to do this in 3 hours and you have to sit here and do this thing, it's a little more of a slog, so that was a gift in kind of following that passion of the hummingbird into the world, learning all these cool things about hummingbirds, and then a passion, into myself about how I connected. And then asking how am I different was also really important. Like I do sometimes like to sit still. I do have they do too, but I mean, I realized their life pattern as I dug into it. I did find some other rhythms, that was kind of interesting. I see here we have bees, because I do, and they were busy, and I'm always working outside in my yard. Yeah, and these wild beings, there's so much we can learn. Every one of these little passionate questions is a passion project for a student. That could take an entire semester if we wanted it to. And also it allows us to see ourselves reflected in the world around us. It allows us to see our own rhythms and way of being reflected in the world around us. And I personally think that this is a big important part of this. I called my business Wild Rhythms for this reason. I think we are so often put into rhythms. There is no example in the natural world of a flower that blooms 24/7, 12 months out of the year. But for so many people in the world, our work schedules and our productivity schedules expect us to be blooming and producing 24/7, or at least 9 hours a day all year long, and so asking ourselves, what are the rhythms that I resonate with, and how can I bring those into my life a little bit? The same kind of thing, and you brought this up with Mount Shasta, you can work with your students, but asking them, about landscapes and wild places. And here's a different set of questions that are very similar. How do you feel in wild places? And, do you feel differently in different landscapes? This is a great way to start with students to weaving into where they're interested in going. Like I say, you're teaching an earth science class. This is amazing, because then they're kind of pulling their own stories and their own experiences in, and then leading into a level of interest in something potentially, but what stories come to their mind? Why are they interested in certain landscapes? And then asking them, what can the landscape teach them? I mean, the things that people can come up with that, again, for ourselves, these are journal questions that I would do for myself and have, but also it really opens up a cool way to get students engaged in a deeper sense of place and a sense of themselves as wild beings within that place. And it allows them to relate these things to their own lives in a way that I think can be very, bringing that educational relevancy up a little bit, potentially. So I want to stop here for a second and ask if there's any thoughts or questions or anything before we move into some resources and sensory awareness stuff.
Yeah, I actually went and ran and grabbed this book, Becoming a Good Creature, which is like the kid version of another one, like I think what it means to be a good creature or something. But we have this in our lending library. And when you were talking about, connecting with different wild species or different, plant and animal and other types of beings, I was thinking about this because it talks a lot about, how we can connect and what we can learn from other living beings, which is so valuable to think in that way. And when I read the adult version of the book, Cy Montgomery was talking about, she learned from, her dog and things. And I was like, man, I guess I've never really thought about what I learned from, I love animals, but I've never really thought about what I learned from them and valuing them in that way. And so I love this resource as a good jumping off point. We were just talking earlier about, jumping off points and how we can start with books or start with different discussions to get the kids thinking. And your discussion has been reminding me of this book and that idea of just what we can learn and how we can value other beings in different ways.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I think that's a great resource. And, and all these things are windows into what can be shorter, mellower conversations, or some of these same questions can take people on, years long personal vision journeys of their own with apprenticing with wild nature in various ways. And so when we kind of put together that wild self sense of place thing, the levels of engagement And as educators and facilitators, we can really choose how far do we want to go into this with what we're doing at this time with this group of students at this time. You know, are we looking at a year-long project here, or are we looking at a 1-week thing? You know, but there's a lot of play here. And I think that's a great resource that Ryan just shared. All right, so let me share a couple others. So we're going to talk a bit now about the sensory awareness piece. So let me share my screen one more time. Okay, so sensory awareness and sense of place activities are, I'm sure that you've been talking about those and you will again, and these are the kind of things that we can again like weave into all sorts of places. But they do a few things in terms of deepening our connection to wild places and ourselves. You know, they slow our rhythms down. They allow us to tap into something out of our thinking brain. They allow us to move out of our conversation with each other and into the landscape. And one of the best ways, I think, with the conversation piece are silent walks and hikes or sits. You know, like we are a conversational species, especially if we're going outside with students. Chatter, 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 excitement, excitement, talk, 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 you know, and that's all well and good. And then to turn our attention toward the place, to turn our attention toward the stories in the landscape, how the person is feeling in the place, you know, silently walking or hiking or sitting, even just for a few minutes, can be really profound. And I will say, I love to start programs this way. It depends on the group. You know, if it's a group of kids who just had a bunch of sugar, it's not the best way to start a program, you know, but if it is, you know, a group that can handle it, starting out with something like that, even silently hiking to the location where you're going to be doing a bunch of activities, can shift everybody's focus to the place in a really nice way. It allows also for the surveying of the energy of the place, which I think is an important part of people feeling comfortable. You know, does it feel really kinetic? You know, is it stormy and windy, and are people a little more nervous? Is it a really calm, warm day? Is it, you know, are there a lot of bird activities in the trees? You know, just what is the energy of the place? And I think this is often overlooked in outdoor education because it's like it's the backdrop. But if we take it from being the backdrop and allow it to be one of our first engagements with really deeply connecting with the place, getting our rhythms to slow down and really tune in, it can also go a long way to helping us see and discover who's there, what animals are there, what's going on in the plant world, but also how do we get ourselves to be there? You know, how do we calm our rhythm down? How do we settle in? So that is an important piece, which leads into the body awareness part, which is really key. I mean, I know for myself individually, when I'm exploring out in the world in a new place or something, you know, I need to tap into how am I feeling? Am I thirsty? Am I hungry? Am I hot? Am I cold? Am I nervous? Do I have an intuitive feeling that maybe I shouldn't be here by myself? You know, all those things, going back to that wild essence, you know, what an animal needs to survive, encouraging ourselves and our students to tap into our bodies when we are connecting with the natural world is really important. It's also where we can find out if somebody is feeling fear or has a concern that maybe they haven't articulated. This is taking this time is what allows them potentially to bring it up. So with that, perspective taking activities of all kinds, I think are really key to shifting our focus when we're out there and really getting more of a sense of place. You know, what is it like to be a coyote living here? Have everybody kind of sit down lower. What would it be like to live here if we were right after a forest fire? Or, you know, you can take whatever's going on in your places, whatever you're studying in your classroom, and then you can say, okay, let's look at perspective that isn't just our own. Let's decenter the human just a bit here and just kind of get that sense of place from a different perspective. And along those lines, you know, for students that can hear, for people that can, you know, have the ability to hear, sound maps are also a great way to kind of get a sense of the place. You know, as humans, when we are sensibly able, sight is our dominant sense. You know, we are not the ones with the huge ears like the rabbits and the deer. You know, we don't have the nose like the bear. You know, eyes are for us our thing. And when we are sighted humans, that's our default. So even just taking us out of that perspective of what we're used to, focusing on sound, focusing on how it feels, you know, the energy, the feeling of the place, just taking us away from our dominant sense can go a long way to investigating sense of place in a way that can be kind of fun and exciting for students and all of that. So now I want to share with you, let me pull up Oh, I got to click. Hold on a second. Let me get the right, there we go. The right thing so that I don't share you my email, which nobody wants to see that. I don't even want to see that half the time. But okay, so this is a resource that is a good one for activities, and it's playfullearning.net, developing a sense of place. There are a whole bunch of free resources you can see here. You can go into tech engineering, art, math, reading. So you can kind of, where are you teaching and what are you looking for? Wanting to add some sense of place stuff into it. And they talk about it, how the terminology of sense of place, it refers to a meaning attributed to a place as influenced by our interactions with it. So what's important here is our interactions with that place are part of it. It's not just sitting in learning about a forest ecosystem, but never going in there. That teaches people about the forest ecosystem. It doesn't give them a sense of place with that forest ecosystem. So this is a great resource to spend some time on. They've got a list of why sense of place is important to include in your programming. This is especially useful if like you're getting permission to go on a field trip, or you're looking for a classroom grant or something like that. There's language on this site that might be helpful to you. Sense of place can inspire stewardship and nurture empathy, develop personal identity, establish knowledge and appreciation. I mean, these are all things that, depending on what your educational goals are, can be really useful. And then there's just some very basic activities here that you can look at, on your own, but that some ideas, and depending on your groups, some of them may sound a little young, but I can say that all of these are things I would do with any age group. So middle school, could certainly have fun with some activities, doing the journaling, that kind of thing. So I would recommend checking this site out, and I'll put this in the chat. I do believe it's also in your note packet, but I'll put it here too, just so it's in the chat place. And let me show another one to you. Oops. Hold on a second. And this one, I know you were just talking about journaling, so we will not spend a ton of time here because I know you just did this, but I want to make sure that you see the resources here on this site, the John Muir Laws site. You can download copies of his book. You can download a whole curriculum on nature journaling here. And journaling, I think, is a lovely thing because it can fit into pretty much any topic that you're teaching. And, students can be working on a journal over time as well. And so they end up with something that's really, valuable for them to keep. And I actually had a student once. I was not in a classroom, but I was working with a school for a year. I think they were fourth graders. And about 5 or 6 years later, I was at an art event and I heard this voice, and I turned around and it's one of the students from that class. And she came up, and the very first thing she started talking about was how she still had her nature journal all those years later. She kept it under her bed. I'm not sure what else was under her bed, but the journal was under the bed. So, that can be a fun way to bring it all in. There's a whole section here just for teachers. Lots of resources, of things that you can look at and say, okay, what's available to me in my class or that I can use with my students. And a lot of it, most of it actually is free. There's an educator forum, a conference that you can attend to get ideas. It's just a beautiful resource. So we'll stop with that. I think that I know you've got more of that kind of stuff coming. And then the last thing I want to show you is a really exciting body of work. In fact, I'm going to wave my bias flag. It's so exciting that I'm working on a doctorate right now, and it's based in this Wild Pedagogies. And so Wild Pedagogies is a body of work that is focused on learning from the more than human voices. It's literally focused on saying, okay, so it's not just humans talking to humans. It's not just us teaching from only our perspective. It's about saying, how do we renegotiate that relationship between human and place by realizing that there is a world of teachers, of wild teachers out there for us. This website has a lot of resources as well. The publications tab you can go to has a ton of articles. There's a book. All the articles are free to download. Some of them are for classroom specific. Some of them are grade specific, early childhood, older. But I want to quickly through this touchstone so you're familiar with this body of work, because I think it really supports that wild essence sense of place exploration. So one of the primary premises of wild pedagogies is that nature is a co-teacher, and that it actually enriches our experience with the natural world when we actively listen to and engage with the wild world around us, and that reminds us that it's not just us and our interpretation. And this doesn't, I'm not necessarily just talking about, telepathic communication, that could be part of it, but I'm talking about the stories the landscape shares with us just by being what it is. The water's running higher in the river. What does that tell us about the snowpack? What is that, what are the stories that we can see? So nature being a co-teacher is a huge piece. Another component of this is that there is a complex and unknown world, and that spontaneity is key. So in environmental ed, we often talk about spontaneity as teachable moments. It's that I've got this program planned over here, but this amazing thing is happening over here. And I was actually teaching a workshop at one point where we were doing nature journaling, and I had all these beautiful little prompts laid out. We were going to hike around this lake, and we were going to do this whole thing. And then we get there and we start walking, and this robin is actively nest building right off the trail, right at the height of the kids. It was about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. I don't think it was probably the smartest place for a nest, but I didn't want to say anything to that robin, but raccoons would have had no trouble. But what it did provide, we pulled away so as not to scare the robin, and we sat down and we spent 45 minutes watching this robin build a nest. There is nothing I could have done that would have been cooler than that. So again, it's that letting that spontaneity piece in. This one particularly important to what we're talking about today is what is wild and where is it? What does wild mean to us as educators? Where do we find it? It can be hard to see. It can be covered over by cultural biases. It can be covered over by expectations of our schools. It can be, but even in the most concrete urban environments, there are ant populations, I guarantee it, in the cracks on the playground. So part of our job is to say, where is the wild, and how can I bring it to my students? Fourth touchstone of wild pedagogies is that it takes time and practice to get into these deep connections. We can't necessarily expect that going out for 5 minutes is going to mean that somebody's going to have a deep connection with a hummingbird. How can we build in time and practice, which there's some unique challenges, of course, because we're all dealing with standards and curriculum expectations, but digging into this touchstone a little bit, and you can read more about it here on the site. It's inspiring to me when I read into it. I know there are constraints we all have, but it also gets me thinking about, okay, how can I, within these constraints, create as much time as possible for this relationship between my students and the places? And knowing that these things lead, just by nature of what they are, to sociocultural change. The more that we have these deep connections, the more that we see ourselves as wild beings connected with wild places, the more likely that people are going to orient in that direction. So it's about creating sociocultural change that is not just human-centered. And again, depending on what you're doing, this may or may not be the dominant part of your work. I've seen people doing wild pedagogies focused work that they couldn't bring this up because where they were, it wasn't appropriate. And then the last piece is how do these relationships, this sense of wildness, this deep sense of place, how does it help us enhance our alliances and our connections to the human communities where we all live? How do we weave these stories together? How do we have these parts become part of our cultural institutions, our political institutions, our educational institutions? And how do we extend the idea of community to be humans and the rest of the living world? So wild pedagogies, I would definitely encourage, if you're intrigued by this website, you could spend a lot of time here. There's a lot of really great resources. A lot of them, like I said, are free, just downloadable papers that you don't have to have an academic subscription to a journal. You can they've got them all on here. That could be another great resource. So with that, our quick little run through a lot of work, I would love to if there's any questions. I know we've also got break time coming here. I can stick around and answer questions. I'll also put a couple ways here in the chat for you to stay in touch. You're very welcome to join my mailing list if you like. I have resources for educators and nature connection practitioners. And then I also host a Facebook group. So if you're into that, I put up articles. A lot of them have to do with education. Some of them are philosophical, but you're very welcome to join there as well. But anyway, I would love to open up now. If you need to take a break, go for it. If there's any questions, I'm happy to hang out and chat. And if not, we can all just call it good. I sure appreciate your time and the invitation to come and do this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deb. I think it seems like maybe we don't have any questions.
Okay, cool.
In the group here, but I know I was jotting down lots of notes. I needed to a lot more space for notes for yours.
Well, and I'm always happy to chat after. So if y'all are incorporating or putting some of this into some of your programming, and you want to bounce ideas around, please feel free to reach out. I mean, I really, I love education and environmental education, and I think this is all very important. And we've covered a lot of ground in a short time. So, if you're like, wait a minute, what? Feel free to give me a holler. But otherwise, I really appreciate the chance to come, and I hope that the rest of your seminar today is just lovely.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, Deb. Great to see
Absolutely. All right. Well, take care, everybody, and good luck with all of your wild essence sense of place work. Okay. Alrighty. Bye-bye.